Very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Nikhil Vaswani, and I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. And today we're very kindly joined by Rob Wiley from Deloitte. The purpose of this event is a retrofit information, support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and is delivered by Turner & Townsend. Thank you, and over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Nikhil. And again, welcome to everyone who's joining us this afternoon. So we are being led to the presentation today by the Deloitte team. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Rob and the Deloitte team. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Warm Homes SHF Fraud Risk Assessment and Management Plan Masterclass. So my name is Rob, and I'm joined by my colleagues Parth and Jamal. And we're from Deloitte, and we're going to be guiding you through today's session. I'll start by just setting out what we're going to cover today. This session is to assist you with producing high-quality fraud risk assessments and management plans. However, we're also going to cover some other relevant background before we get into those specific areas. So we're going to start by providing a summary of the fraud, error and non-compliance function that Deloitte will be running on the Warm Homes scheme. We're then going to provide some background on what we mean by fraud and error, what drives people to commit fraud, and describe some principles to work towards when designing an effective counter-fraud framework. We're then going to give a reminder of the submission process for your risk assessments and management plans before going into some guidance on how to produce a fraud risk assessment and some tips based on what we've seen for producing and reviewing government fraud risk assessments. And finally, the types of fraud risks you may wish to consider as part of that risk assessment. And finally, we're going to finish by going through some points to consider when producing your fraud management plans. As was mentioned at the start, we do have a detailed Q&A session at the end. And if you've got any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer at the end. So Deloitte's very proud to be supporting DESNZ in the Warm Homes grant scheme and to be working with Turner & Townsend, who brings significant experience in the retrofit space. Turner & Townsend are acting as DESNZ's core delivery partner, and the Deloitte team are going to be supporting them by running a proactive fraud, error, non-compliance or FANC function for both the social housing wave 3 and also the local grant schemes. We'll work closely with Turner & Townsend in a collaborative approach that will deliver a comprehensive and effective fraud prevention strategy. Now, whilst not all here today, I wanted to use this opportunity to briefly introduce some members of our team. So Jules Corborn-Weber will be the overall FANC function lead. He leads the Deloitte forensic team and has over 20 years experience in matters including fraud investigation and advisory and support a range of government departments. And then myself, so I'll act as FANC function director. I've got similar background in fraud investigation and advisory, and I've also assisted on a number of government grant schemes over the years. Parth will lead our assurance activity. His particular relevant background is that he has produced and reviewed a huge number of government fraud risk assessments over the past few years, and he's going to share some insights he's got a little later. Marcus is our analytics specialist, and he'll lead our data analytics-led monitoring activity. And finally, Jamal will lead our reporting activity. So the FANC function's overarching objective is the proactive management of fraud, error and non-compliance risks across the entire supply chain. This isn't just about reacting to fraud, it's about preventing it in the first place. We aim to support the scheme's supply chain in implementing effective preventative controls and deterrents, closing vulnerabilities to minimise losses. Ultimately, this is to help the scheme meet its core objective to drive home improvements of eligible housing stock. The key point I want to emphasise here is that we're here to support grant recipients. We will have a picture of the entire grant scheme, and so we'll get a good idea of emerging vulnerabilities, effective controls and other prevention mechanisms, and we'll strive to share these to improve fraud management across the entire SHF grant scheme. Looking at the key aspects of our function, so starting with supporting grant recipients, as I mentioned, we're here to support. This might be through answering ad hoc queries or perhaps offering more structured assistance in developing and implementing your fraud management strategies. Now next, learning and development. So we're going to act as a central hub for best practices, sharing knowledge through masterclasses like this one and keeping you updated on emerging fraud trends through comms delivered through Turner & Townsend. Now, if one local authority suffers a fraud, we want to be able to warn others and suggest effective mitigations so that it doesn't become a widespread issue across the scheme. Then assurance. So we'll be conducting assurance activities on key aspects of the scheme's counter-fraud framework. This is going to start with assessing your FRAs and FMPs to ensure grant recipients are starting out in the best possible fraud prevention position. And we'll progress into mid-programme reviews of live documents and controls once the scheme is in drawdown. Then monitoring and verification. We'll be developing a monitoring and verification capability whereby we'll look at data collected from across the scheme and look for any anomalies, for example, properties that appear to have received multiple tranches of funding allocation. This will be complemented by verification of supporting documentation driven off this monitoring and also from random samples. By performing this activity holistically, we'll be able to identify anomalies or patterns that might be missed at a local level. Findings that will benefit grant recipients can then be shared through our learning and development activity on an anonymised basis to drive improvement across the scheme. And then finally, reporting. We'll be aggregating local reporting on fraud prevented, detected and recovered, giving DESNZ a view of fraud and error across the overall grant scheme. In terms of reaching us, we'll be feeding into regular comms from Turner and Townsend, and your DSMs will have a route to us. You can also email the mailbox. So that gives you a high-level view of the SHF scheme's function, planned activity, and then I'll pass over to Jamal to talk through some background on fraud.
Thanks for the introduction, Rob. So fraud and error represent significant challenges for any organisation. Fraud is defined as an intentional act of deception for personal gain or to cause a loss to another party. Error, on the other hand, is the unintentional misallocation or inefficient allocation of public funds. While different in intent, both can have serious consequences and their impacts can be far-reaching. If we consider the economic impact of fraud, in 2023, the UK Fraud Costs Measurement Committee highlighted a staggering £219 billion cost to the UK economy. This isn't just about the direct financial loss. It undermines trust and confidence in the public services. In addition to the economic loss caused, fraud has a significant impact on resources, where it consumes significant resources that could be used to fight other crimes. It represents 40% of all crimes in England and Wales. Fraud and error directly impact the quality and quantity of public services, diverting public funds and also government attention from where they are truly needed. In addition to the above, victims of fraud can often suffer significant financial and emotional distress, impacting their personal lives and also their livelihoods. The public sector is a prime target for fraud. Estimated losses from fraud and error range from £55 billion to £81 billion. However, public sector bodies like the Public Sector Fraud Authority are making progress in the fight against fraud, where in 2023 it prevented and recovered £311 million worth of taxpayers' money. The government has an ambitious target of £4.3 billion in savings by 2029-2030. The thank function activity set out by Rob and the requirements on grant recipients further shows the government's desire to keep SHF losses from fraud and error. So why do people commit fraud? Often it's a combination of factors: financial stress, pressure to meet targets, weak controls, and a sense of rationalization. The best way to understand this is through the fraud triangle. The first factor to consider is opportunity. This refers to the circumstances that allow a fraud to occur. Think about internal controls, weaknesses in processes, lack of oversight, or simply a lack of segregation of duties. For example, a close relative of one of the suppliers is an employee of the GR who is responsible for the selection of suppliers. This may present an opportunity for an unfair supply selection process. The second factor is incentive. This is the motivation behind the fraudulent act. This could be financial pressure, such as gambling debts or personal financial difficulties. It could also be non-financial pressures, such as pressure to meet unrealistic targets, fear of job loss, or pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle. If we think about this particular scheme, one of the incentives to commit fraud could be pressure to meet targets, which could lead to deliberate installation of substandard products to allow for this target to be met at the lowest cost possible for the GR. Finally, there's rationalization. This is the process by which an individual justifies their fraudulent actions. They may minimize the harm caused, believe they deserve the money, or convince themselves that they will repay the funds later. This allows them to overcome their ethical concerns and proceed with the fraudulent act. For example, a supplier may think that they deserve to be paid a greater fee by the government and subsequently intentionally inflate their costs as a result. Understanding these motivations is key to effective prevention.
Thanks, Jamal. So as many of you may be aware, the government has introduced a new failure to prevent fraud offence as part of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which comes into force on the 1st of September. It makes it a criminal offence for associated persons of an organisation to commit fraud that benefits their organisation. For an organisation to have a defence against it, they are required to have in place reasonable fraud prevention procedures. Now, the government produced guidance as to what constitutes reasonable procedures in November 2024, and the principles set out in this guidance are a very useful point of reference for any counter-fraud framework, not just in the private sector. It's not just a checklist, it's a proactive, integrated approach. The best way to think about it is a 5-pillar foundation as follows. Starting with governance, strong leadership and a clear tone from the top are crucial. In the SHF scheme, responsibility for mitigating fraud, risks identified as part of the grant scheme, can be clearly defined and documented in the risk assessment. Overall responsibilities for all aspects of fraud management can be set out in the fraud management plan. Then thinking about risk assessment. A comprehensive fraud risk assessment is the cornerstone of any effective counter-fraud framework. For SHF, this will identify risks applicable to the scheme alongside potential vulnerabilities, and it assesses the effectiveness of existing or new controls. Regular updates are vital to reflect changing circumstances and emerging risks. Thirdly, proportionate procedures and controls. Organisations must implement appropriate procedures and controls proportionate to the level of risk. There will be many such procedures and controls in place for SHF, many of which may already be in place, such as where rigorous background checks on suppliers are undertaken as part of a robust procurement process, for example. The fourth point, communication and training. Regular training and communication are essential to raise awareness of fraud risks and responsibilities. Now, employees involved in SHF need to understand their roles in preventing and detecting fraud, and where they're a gatekeeper to a particularly important process, they may need additional training or education. And then finally, monitoring, review and assurance. Monitoring and review are critical to ensuring controls are operating as expected to prevent fraud. Now, processes around this, amongst other issues, will be defined as part of your fraud management plan. Keeping these pillars in mind will assist you in shaping an effective counter-fraud framework, and putting in place robust counter-fraud risk assessment and management plans will help align you to the government's counter-fraud functional standard, which highlights the importance of action plans, response plans, and risk assessments. So here I will just talk briefly to remind you of the processes for submission and assessment of your fraud risk assessment and management plans. Grant recipients are required to have these in place approved risk assessments and management plans in order to fully access their grant funding. Before I go into the process, a reminder that your fraud risk assessment and management plans are documents specific to your organisation to help you identify and manage fraud and error risks that you may be exposed to in the delivery of SHF. The success of the scheme is reliant on the effective management of fraud right down to the point at which funds are being distributed, and your risk assessment management plans are your chance to demonstrate that you're effectively identifying and managing these risks. The fraud risk assessment provides an assessment of where you may be vulnerable to fraud by identifying specific risks, mapping controls against those risks, and calculating residual risk scores which indicate how likely a fraud is, considering controls in place. The template that's been provided has been used across government for grant schemes and by government departments, so it's very much a standard format. The fraud management plan sets out how fraud, error, and non-compliance will be managed by each grant recipient. The submission and assessment process is straightforward. Once you've completed your fraud risk assessment and management plans, please submit it by emailing to the SHF inbox for RISE, which is whshf@turntown.co.uk. It would be helpful if you could submit your risk assessment and management plan at the same time if possible. They will then be passed on to us, and we will assess each submission against a set of criteria which includes whether they've been prepared in line with guidance and templates provided and their substance. So do they have a suitable range of fraud risks, and do the controls listed adequately mitigate the risks under each pillar? Now, our assessment will result in one of three ratings: a green rating, where the assessment meets all the criteria set; an amber rating, where the assessment has passed, but documents require improvements. So in this case, feedback will be provided via DSMs, and you'll be asked to update your documents. But the updated documents will not need to be resubmitted for reassessment. And finally, a red rating, whereby the assessment failed the majority of the criteria. In this case, feedback will be provided on why the documents have failed, again through the DSM. Additional support will be available in the form of feedback sessions from us to provide assistance in updating to the required standard. The documents will need to be updated and resubmitted within 10 working days, whereby they'll go through reassessment in the same manner. And feedback will be provided by us within 10 working days of you submitting your fraud risk assessments and management plans. As a reminder, that will come through your DSM. So now I'm going to pass over to Parth to talk about some fraud risk assessment specific points.
Thank you, Rob. Rob, kindly walk through what the assessment process will look like for the submitted fraud risk assessments and fraud management plans. We'll now talk about how to produce your fraud risk assessment. To start with, I'd like to provide a short background on some areas to be aware of. Whilst undoubtedly for a fantastic purpose, retrofit schemes are unfortunately attractive targets for fraudsters as the government makes funding available and households strive to make their homes greener and lower bills. The increasing focus on green initiatives has created new opportunities for scams. In 2021, Citizens Advice found that a shocking 19 million had been targeted with a green scam in the past year. And as recently as 2024, an insulation scandal occurred where homes were fitted with incorrect materials, which resulted in many homes having mold, damp, and decay. There are a number of red flags to be aware of, many of which may feature in your fraud risk assessment. For example, installers may offer discounted work, but where prices are artificially inflated and the discount is in fact a false representation. Whilst less of a risk where government funded, vulnerable consumers can often be pressured into installing unsuitable or unnecessary upgrades, such as heat pumps or spray foam insulation. Some installers have been seen to deliver substandard work or use unsuitable materials, leading to further problems and costs. Most notably, that has been with substandard wall insulation installed over the past 5 years with the assistance of government grant funding, which has led to huge problems for households suffering with damp problems. There are also a huge array of issues within the supply chain and visibility of who is doing installation work and ensuring that they are appropriately qualified to do so. It is common for installers like anyone to be motivated by money, and by subcontracting to cheaper outfits who lack the necessary expertise, they can make higher margin, whilst homeowners are often the ones to suffer. Moving on to how to actually produce your fraud risk assessment. So in order to produce a robust fraud risk assessment, there are a number of steps that need to be considered. First of all, developing a robust fraud risk assessment is a collaborative process. Often there'll be multiple teams involved with the grant process. To ensure that all fraud risks are covered at each stage of the grant process, ensure that a range of relevant parties are consulted. This will ensure that a comprehensive assessment takes place. Secondly, consider each stage of the grant process. Different fraud risks exist at different stages of the grant process. Take the different stages from property identification through to supply selection, expenditure, commitment, and invoice settlement, and consider all possible sources of risk at each stage. It is also important to consider sources of information, both qualitative and quantitative, that will be relevant for your risk assessment. These could include examples of fraud and error that have occurred from previous grant schemes, transactional data, or any previous internal audit reports which have findings of fraud. Consider areas where error is more likely to occur. Certain processes and stages of the grant process are likely to inherently be more susceptible to error due to the complexities involved, high volumes involved, or even the large number of people that may be involved in a process. Conducting brainstorming sessions and walkthroughs with system owners and key personnel involved in the grant process is also a very important step. This will enable a full spectrum of risks to be considered and relevant mitigating controls to be identified and potentially tested for effectiveness. And finally, ensure that you document fraud risks and controls. Remember, if it's not documented, it's not done. Ensure that each fraud risk has an allocated owner. When documenting inherent fraud risks, consider who can perform the fraud, what the fraudulent action could be, and the outcome of the fraud itself. When documenting controls, consider the nature of the control, how it mitigates the fraud risk identified, and whether there are any limitations of the control that may still allow fraud to happen. Rate residual risks for impact and likelihood. And finally, consider whether the residual risk will be tolerated and whether there is an action plan that is in place to monitor this risk. As mentioned earlier, creating a clear and effective fraud risk assessment is absolutely fundamental. So here are some top tips from our past experience of producing government standard fraud risk assessments. First of all, ensure that there's clear articulation. Clearly define each fraud risk, specifying who could commit the fraud. For example, it could be an employee, it could be a supplier, or it could even be a beneficiary. What is the fraudulent action that has been committed? For example, it could be inflated invoices have been prepared, false claims have been made, or there's been collusion between an employee of a grant recipient and a supplier. And finally, the outcome. What is the consequence of the fraud? Is it a financial loss, or is it reputational damage? And DESNAs have very kindly provided support to grant recipients to develop their fraud risk assessments in the material that has been provided as well. Ensure that you avoid duplication of fraud risks. To ensure each risk is unique and avoid unnecessary repetition. This will ensure that the fraud risk assessment is not clunky and excessive, and it's easy to follow, concise, and also streamlined. Ensure that each risk has a unique identification number and can clearly be mapped to the specific area that it falls under. And likewise, in relation to controls too, ensure that you assign unique identification numbers to controls for easy tracking, analysis, and also for mapping against the relevant risks. This will also enable you to see where one control may mitigate multiple risks. In terms of residual risk, ensure that you explain why residual risk remains despite mitigating controls. This demonstrates thoroughness and an understanding of the risk environment and how the risk may impact you. Rationale for ratings. Clearly justify the impact and likelihood ratings for each risk. This ensures transparency and also consistency. And finally, a fraud risk assessment is a living document. It's not something that's produced once a year and then left on a shelf and not looked at again. It should be regularly used, monitored, and updated on a periodic basis, or when a fraud risk event may occur. Grant recipients are required to consider fraud risks on the 5 pillars on their fraud risk assessments. You'll have all received guidance which sets out what the pillars are and some good examples of fraud risks under each pillars. But I'll spend a few minutes here talking through these pillars and highlighting some notable risks. It is expected that several fraud risks will be documented in each pillar. Across each of the pillars, it is important to consider both internal fraud risks. So this is where fraud is committed by someone within your organization, and external fraud risks, where fraud is committed by an external party, usually to misappropriate funds. It is natural to focus on external fraud, as we don't like to think of our colleagues being capable of committing fraud, but from the experience that all of us have gathered, even close colleagues can come under pressures that we don't know about, which push them into behaviors that we wouldn't expect. If we move on to the 5 pillars, so the first pillar is scheme process/administration. So fraud risks that may arise through the administration of the scheme itself. Clearly, there's a risk around substandard work not being signed off appropriately, but the key risk I want to highlight is payment diversion risk. This is a very common fraud risk, and there will certainly be attempts at this during the scheme. It typically involves fraudsters intercepting email exchanges between accounts payable functions and suppliers, and persuading accounts payables teams to change bank mandate details so that when invoices are paid, funds are actually sent to fraudsters rather than the suppliers. Once gone, it is very difficult to recover funds, and I've seen numerous examples of this over the years. Strong payment controls are essential. Something as basic as calling back a supplier to confirm any payment detail changes requested can be very effective. We should ensure that accounts payable teams are alert to this risk given how common it is. Next, we have the customer beneficiary pillar. So the fraud risk posed by occupants of households. Here, risk can include misrepresentation of private households to fill infill criteria, or collusion between the resident of the property and the supplier to inflate costs. Next, we have the property pillar. So fraud risk that comes from the property itself. Perhaps proposed measures at the property already exist or have been funded by previous schemes. Or the proposed property sits outside your local authority and may therefore have been subject to attempts to fund retrofit from other local authorities. Or maybe the EPC rating has been falsified in order to appear eligible. Next, we have the measure, product and service pillar. This is fraud risk coming from the measure being applied. There's a risk of attempts to fund work that is not within the scheme eligibility, or work being undertaken to a standard that would not meet scheme requirements, possibly so that suppliers could cut costs to achieve a higher margin at the expense of quality. And finally, the supply installer. To some extent, this pillar cuts across many of the above pillars. For example, it's the supplier who actually installs the measure of the product themselves. Effectively, this is the risk posed by the suppliers that you'll be engaging with to carry out the relevant works. This is one of the more difficult areas to mitigate, and likely an area where we will see attempts from suppliers to push the boundaries. For example, overlooking services proposed but not delivered when invoicing. As an added complication, we will see suppliers subcontracting work out, bringing in additional parties that need to be considered. For example, is the work being subcontracted to a non-compliant installer? Supply due diligence, therefore, is a very important and an effective procurement process that can help to ensure value for money and that any conflicts of interest are managed. When considering fraud risk at the time of works being invoiced, it's important to obtain visibility of supply chain used and the full transparency of expenditure incurred so that you can identify any anomalies or any instances of potential non-compliance. We'll now move on to examples of mitigating controls. As with the consideration of fraud risk, the department's guidance provides very helpful guidance and examples on the types of controls to consider when populating your fraud risk assessment. It's important to note that effective fraud mitigation requires a multi-layered approach. The control should be both specific, which is targeted at a specific process or transactions, and pervasive, which are organization-wide that influence the overall control environment and therefore the risk assessment itself. For example, a specific control might be that your finance team has a preventative control that requires them to phone up a supplier to confirm a request to their change of bank details to mitigate the risk of payment diversion fraud that I talked about earlier. Whereas a clear articulation of a zero-tolerance approach towards fraud, alongside creating a culture which encourages staff to speak up where they think something is not right, will strengthen the control environment across your organization and across the scheme in a pervasive manner. Taking each of the different types of controls in turn. So first of all, we have directive controls. So this is where employees are directed to take a particular course of action. For example, being required to disclose any conflicts of interest that arise, where, for example, they may have a connection to a supplier bidding for or undertaking work, or even to a particular household. Next, you have deterrent controls. So these are an example of this is whilst it's not expected that grant recipients undertake site visits to verify all completed work, and a risk-based approach to conducting these site visits to verify completed work and a clear communication of this approach to suppliers can act as a deterrent to the suppliers for them taking shortcuts. Preventative controls. So where possible, preventative controls can be most effective at stopping fraud. Segregation of duties is a common example, which ensures no one is able to commit wrongdoing without check and challenge. Detective controls provide routes whereby potential wrongdoing can be escalated. Whistleblowing policy and reporting mechanism, for example, can provide a route for employees and third parties to report suspected fraud or error or other concerns. Studies have actually shown that 42% of fraud is discovered through whistleblowing reports. So it's a very important measure to have in place. And finally, corrective controls. So where you do experience fraud or error, it is important for you to have in place the best mechanisms possible by which you are able to recover funds. This may be a clawback clauses in contracts or requirements for work to be remediated where they are not of a sufficient enough standard. Where necessary, it is important to have in place a plan to investigate and potentially make criminal reports. It is important to remember that your controls need to be proportionate to the risks that they are addressing, and your effort is directed toward the highest risk of fraud. A range of control types is important. Bear in mind that weighting towards detective and corrective controls without any other types may result in higher levels of loss. Generally, given the difficulties in recovery due to fraud, in particular prevention, deterrent, and directive controls can play a critical part. Once you've set your controls, it's important to identify and document any limitations with them. Few controls in themselves are 100% effective, and by being clear about any limitations, we can accurately assess residual risk and ensure that they are supported by other controls where necessary. I'll now hand it over to Rob, who will talk about considerations in documenting your fraud risk management plan. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mark. So as with the fraud risk assessment, the department has provided a very useful guidance as to what is expected in fraud management plan. So please do follow that closely. I'm just going to draw out some highlights here before we close. At an overarching level, whilst a fraud risk assessment sets out specific fraud risks and specific controls in place to mitigate them, the management plan sets out your overall approach to managing fraud risk. It includes details of strategy and governance, details of how controls operate, for example, who does what, when and how, as well as the approach to using data. It also sets out your approach to continuous improvement and what to do with instances where your controls identify fraud and error, i.e. how will you investigate and resolve fraud or error cases. Now, a few tips for everyone to consider. Firstly, it's important to identify an owner of the management plan who is suitably senior. They needn't be a fraud expert, but they do need to have the appropriate seniority to be able to ensure that the plan is completed and implemented. Identifying an owner early will also ensure it's produced in good time and will avoid any delays to scheme delivery. Secondly, on controls and processes, we do recognise that you already have in place many controls and processes relevant to the SHF scheme. In your management plan, you don't need to repeat all of these. However, where you do refer to them, you should explain how these controls or processes manage scheme-specific fraud risk. And for critical processes, you might do this by briefly summarising them in your management plan, as well as referring to the overarching processes. And thirdly, linked to that point, try to be specific. For example, in your management plans, provide details of names, roles, and an indication of seniority. Organisation charts or extracts thereof can also be helpful. You should provide time frames for how long processes are expected to take and the periodicity of monitoring, reviews, or checks performed. Where you refer to training, think about who the training is most relevant to and whether the right people are being trained. Try and make it SHF scheme specific. And finally, I want to reiterate that your fraud management plan will be an essential document as the scheme moves to delivery. It will give you comfort that you have considered key fraud and error risks and sought to put in place processes to manage them. If something does go wrong, you'll have a record of what to do. And if there's a fraud and error related query, you have a document to refer to. It's worth investing the time now to ensure you're best prepared and also to show your internal stakeholders and the department that you're doing everything you can to ensure funds available under this scheme go to the places where they're most needed. Please remember that each management plan will be specific to your organisation. It reflects your own management approach, should be closely aligned to your own fraud risk assessment, and ensure that the effort and resources are directed in the most efficient manner, typically towards your greatest areas of fraud and error risk. So that brings us to the end of our presentation.